Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the World Affairs Council of Orange County. My name is Rick Putnam, and I am one of the Council's trustees and programs committee members, and will be moderating today's event featuring Dr. Eric Haseltine, entitled Technology, Geopolitical, Espionage, and the New Russian Threat. I first want to thank Peggy Ferris, council member and friend of Dr. Haseltine's, for introducing us to him. This is an excellent example of the power within our council, and we look forward to further collaboration in that way going forward. We'll be here this afternoon for about 45 minutes to an hour. And as he hopes for a conversational style webinar, please feel free to submit questions via the live chat to me, which I can sort through and then provide to Eric during his talk. We've also provided Eric with a number of questions that were pre-submitted earlier, and he'll address some of those as we go through. Now, a few words of background on Dr. Haseltine. Eric was born in Trona, California, and has an undergraduate degree from Berkeley and a PhD in physiological psychology from Indiana University. He spent 13 years at Hughes Aircraft early in his career, where he rose to the position of Director of Engineering. He joined Walt Disney Imagineering in 1992, the research and development group, working on large-scale virtual reality projects, and ultimately was responsible for all technology projects. In 2002, and in the wake of the September 11 attacks, when he was head of research and development for Imagineering, he left to join the National Security Agency as Director of Research. From 2005 to 2007, Eric was Associate Director for Science and Technology in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, that organization's first, a position he described in a 2006 US News and World Report interview by stating, "You can think of me as the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States intelligence community." He is an author, inventor, and futurist, and specializes in cybersecurity, personal protection, and privacy, has over 70 perfected and pending patents, and has written over 150 articles and publications in scientific and technology journals, including the magazine Discover. With that, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Eric Haseltine.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's a great pleasure to be here. And first of all, you mentioned I'm an inventor. I have a couple laboratories, and I'm in one of them right now, still working on new stuff. So today I'm going to talk about four things. The first is I'm going to give some context about the Russian threat. Try to get inside their head, if you will. And I think that's going to be very important to understand everything that follows. Next, I'm going to tell a story that illustrates how the Russians pursue their goals. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of dial forward, because this story starts in 1977 and ends in 1986, but I'm going to bring it up to today to talk about what the Russians have been doing lately. And finally, I'm going to conclude with a few remarks about what I think we can do about this threat. Let's go back in history. You're Russia. And what does the West look like to you? It looks like Napoleon and Hitler. Now, we think of the West as the good guys, but the Russians do not. They have had really bad experiences. And then, if you also consider, if you were to look at the borders of Europe prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union and after, what you would see is that their hegemony, not to mention their country, has shrunk quite a bit. So this enemy that they have worried about since Napoleon is now literally at their door. To make matters worse, a lot of their former republics have aligned themselves with the West, and in particular, some of them are now in NATO. And I just want you to all imagine whether Florida and New Mexico left the United States and become part of the Warsaw Pact. Think about that. Well, that's what happened to them. If you now dial forward and you look at what's happened to them economically, during the Cold War, they were a pretty big economy. they had about $1 for every 3 we did to spend on national defense. Now, if you take NATO into account, the Russians have about $1 for every 13 that we spend on defense. And they do not have Silicon Valley. They do not have the robust, innovative startup infrastructure that we do, but they have to keep pace. And they have kept pace. You know, let me tell you a quick story. You might wonder, well, how did I get from being executive vice president at Disney to running R&D at the NSA? Well, that's a long story in its own right. But because I didn't know squat about intelligence, I had a mentor, a Yoda, named Rick. And Rick was a Russian expert. And he said to me, you know, Eric, it was my job at NSA for 20 years to decide how high to set the bar against the Russian threat to our own security. And I'm talking nuclear launch codes. I'm talking presidential communications. I'm talking the databases and information networks of the intelligence community. And in looking back, I realized that I set the bar too low in every case. The Russians were not only better than I thought, they were not only better than I imagined, they were better than I could imagine. And therefore, you never want to take them lightly. Now, when you think about the Russian approach, if you were in Russia's shoes and you had $1 for every 13 that was allied against you, what would you do? Well, the Russians have, over the last 70 years, adopted a strategy, part of which is to say, we can't invest everywhere, obviously, but where can we invest to get better than the West in a few areas that will be decisive? We don't have to win across the board. We just have to win in 1 or 2 areas, and we can stay even with the West. And one of those areas, there are a number. Electronic warfare was one. Space is another. High energy weapons are another. And at the very top of the list is technology spycraft. And the reason is, Rick Proto, again, my mentor, said to me, he said, you know, the Russians have had a 20-year head start on everybody in the world going after networks and information systems because their main enemy, us, was the only network-centric player in the world. So they went to school on network exploitation 20 years for everybody else. And so the whole business of applying technology for intelligence and applying technology to take down a network-centric operator such as the United States is their top priority. And it's not just to get inside and steal. It's not just to, let us say, take something down. It is also to leave behind information which will cause your enemy, us, to be fractioned. The Russian General Staff has published, and I've read a lot of their work, and they have basically said, bits are the new bullets. And we're going to have more bits and better bits than anyone else, and that's how we're going to win. In fact, we're not even going to have to fight. So if you look, for example, at their latest attempt to pull NATO apart, they don't ever want to fight NATO. And they don't think they're ever going to have to. They're going to get NATO to tear itself apart. And you know, they're kind of making some progress in that respect. So let me illustrate the Russian approach with a story. And this is from my book, The Spy in Moscow Station, which was told to me by the main character, Charles Gandy, who was, I guess you could say, the Tom Cruise Mission Impossible guy for real. He went overseas, he did audacious things, he was very technical. And he told me that it all began in the summer and fall of 1977 in Moscow, where the United States had recruited assets, you might call them spies, Russian citizens, who were collecting secrets for us. And one by one, they were getting arrested, interrogated, tortured, and executed. Over the space of 6 months, we know of at least 5 that are public that were arrested this way. Some of them, including Evgeny Ogorodnikov, Andrei Filatov, and especially Adolf Kolkachev, who was so-called billion-dollar spy, these were devastating. Not only were they devastating, but they were embarrassing. So no less than Stansfield Turner, the director of the CIA, said, no more. We are not spying on Russia using humans anymore because they're just too much better than us. But the chief of station in Moscow, a guy named Gus Hathaway, who had a very colorful background. He'd fought in World War II, he'd been wounded, and the year before, when a fire had broken out in the embassy and the so-called fire department from Moscow, which was really uniformed KGB, came up, he stood with a gun outside the station in Moscow to invite them not to come in. And he got a very high award for that. And he was an old school cold warrior. And he did not take lightly to being told, don't do your job in Moscow. So in desperation, and if you understand the intelligence community, you'll understand what I mean by desperation. Basically, in the book, I have what I call the who hates who chart. And it talks about the Washington national security bureaucracy back in those days, the 70s and 80s. And it talks about the National Security Council, the State Department, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. And basically, it's an intricate diagram showing who hated who and who was allied with who. No one liked anybody. And so NSA and CIA have been at loggerheads probably since the late 70s. For reasons we don't have to go into, I'd be happy to answer that. But they basically hate each other, and they still do to this day. When I took over my role at NSA, I went to my counterpart at CIA, who was the deputy director of CIA, in charge of science and technology. And I said, look, Don, let's cooperate. I'm from Disney. I don't know squat about this rivalry between us. And he said, Eric, get out of my office. Al-Qaeda is our target. You are our enemy. And that's what really goes on inside the national security community. And so all of that being the case, Gus Hathaway, in desperation, reaches out to someone he had heard give a talk a few years before on the sophistication of the Russian technology threat. Because Hathaway didn't believe that he had any human tradecraft errors that were leading to the roll-ups of his assets in Moscow. He believed that there was some ultra-sophisticated technology that was escaping the sweeps of both the CIA and the State Department in the embassy or elsewhere in Moscow. So he called in the intelligence community's smartest technologist, Charles Gandy. He summoned him to Moscow. And he said, look, we got a problem. Just a month ago, I told the ambassador under protest the identity of 3 of our assets before he sent the information back to President Carter. And the next day, all 3 of them were arrested, tortured, and executed. I believe we got a compromise somewhere here in the embassy. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but I am going to tell you enough about it to make my point. What Gandy ultimately found while he was in Moscow, and he went there 3 different times, he basically found what was going on. He found not exactly which information technology in which offices had been penetrated, but he found that it had happened, and he actually heard, through means again that we won't talk about, the people who were listening. He heard their conversations, he heard what they were getting, and he listened to the actual transmissions that were coming out of the device. He briefed the ambassador and Gus Hathaway and said, look, here's what's going on. In the spring of 1978. But when he went back to the US, he couldn't get anybody to do anything about it. And this partly has to do with the State Department not being too worried about spies. They basically say, look, we want them to know what we're thinking. That's what we're here for. What's the big deal? And they didn't really care too much about our assets getting rolled up because the Russians got irritable and cranky when we spied on them. And that made the State Department's job more difficult. The CIA, for their own part, didn't want to pursue it, strangely enough, because it made them look bad. In fact, about 2 years after Gandy found out that something had happened, the director of the CIA sent the NSA an order, tell this guy Gandy to cease and desist and go back to making and breaking codes. It wasn't until the French in 1983 found an ultra-sophisticated bug in one of their optical character readers in their embassy in Moscow. And the director of counterintelligence in France, who had been buddies with the then director of the NSA, called him and said, hey, look, send someone over here to look at this thing, which Gandhi did. And it was astonishingly sophisticated. And he goes to the head of InfoSec, the most important defensive person at the NSA. He tells him about it. And the guy's name is Walt Dealey, one of the more colorful characters you're ever going to read about. And he said, well, shit, get over there and stop this. And he said, I can't. I've been ordered by the director of Central Intelligence, who at that time was in charge of the whole intelligence community, including NSA. And he said, I can't. And Gandhi said, well, what would it take? Walt Dealey said to Gandhi, what would it take? And Gandhi chuckles and laughs and says, well, okay, if President Reagan said we could do it, then we could do it. 3 days later, Gandhi got a knock at his door. Walt Dealey comes in, smoking like a chimney, throws a letter on his desk from President Reagan, authorizing Gandhi to do anything and everything and ordering Shultz to cooperate, Secretary of State George Shultz. Dealey had gone to the president and said, we got a huge problem here. And so Reagan wrote a letter and said, okay, have at it, go find out what's going on. But what Gandhi ultimately found out, and I'll tell you a little bit about the tradecraft that was involved, because it's genius. Gandhi found out that what the Russians were doing was they had an implant in a particular location that was monitoring highly classified text information, and it was broadcasting it out in little bursts that were jumping around in the frequency spectrum. But no sweep would have ever found it because the Russians ingeniously hid the information in basically what it amount to a jamming in the open. They had 2 huge television stations that created huge interference, and the Russians came up with a technique of hiding their information underneath the broadcast in the television network. This was an audacious, theoretically impossible thing to do, but Gandhi discovered how they actually had done it. Finally, after getting the approval from Reagan, they go over to Moscow, they recover the equipment, they find what happened. This is in 1984. So what happened? As a result of finding the biggest penetration of national security in the whole history of the United States, the most devastating, nothing happened. George Shultz, who I interviewed for the book, had told his people, I don't want to hear about this, and I don't want to hear about Gandhi. Bring me a smoking gun or go away. So Walt Dealey named the project Project Gunman, put a report with 2 smoking 45 caliber pistols called Project Gunman, sent it to Shultz, and it basically was in your face. You wanted a smoking gun? Here's your smoking gun. Shultz was furious because his own people had said there was nothing to it. The CIA had said there was nothing to it. And in the end, what was done? Nothing was done. In fact, Walt Dealey got so frustrated, he called Dan Rather and leaked the story. So in 1985, Dan Rather went and let off the news saying the Russians had implanted something in the embassy. And there were a lot of commissions after that and a lot of finger pointing. No one was held accountable. No one was fired. And in the end, absolutely nothing was done. Now, that's not a very satisfying ending, but there was some good that came of that story. Gandhi learned new respect. He learned a lot of tradecraft that he could apply to other people. And of course, it helped me write a fun book. But I think there is a deep lesson in what happened there. And I'll summarize it this. The Russians learned in this kind of origin story of what's happening today, that if you lean way forward, take enormous risks, and get discovered, the worst that can happen is your adversary will tear themselves apart in denial and blame. Because that's exactly what happened, and that's what I describe in the book, and that's the context of the so-called who hates who chart. And the technology that the Russians used was in one of these spikes that I talk about, where they line up their strength against our weakness. I'll say a little bit about that technology. A lot of you have probably heard about the problems in Cuba and China with our embassy officials and with the Canadians, where they had headaches, brain damage, nausea, heard loud noises. When I heard about that, I called Gandhi. He's still alive at the age of 89. And I said, you and I know what that is, don't we? He goes, oh yeah, we know exactly what that is. And yet the CIA and the State Department to this day actually don't know what it was. And that's the fascinating thing, how people inside the government, either kind of retired old farts like Gandhi and me, we knew exactly what it was. And here's kind of the point, that the Russians not only invest in technologies like the ones that were causing the brain damage in Cuba, and those things have to do, by the way, with very sophisticated microwave transmission, which I'll get to in a moment, and why they were using such high energy levels in Cuba. But the point is that the Russians know a lot about us, and they know we fight each other. They know we hate each other, and above all, they know that we are technically arrogant, that we cannot believe that anybody would be better than them, than us. And the fact is, in a lot of respects, when it comes to the technology of spycraft, and I'll put aside spy satellites, which I don't think anyone is better than that than us, the Russians are way, way, way ahead of us. So let me kind of bring it forward to today with some examples. And in my book, I call this the cyber blind spot. In America, when we train computer security professionals, and when we talk about cyber, we think of computers and networks and malware and firewalls and loss prevention systems and encryption and all this, and the Russians do too. But the Russians also look at computers and networks as physics. They look at a computer as something that radiates and receives electromagnetic energy, vibration, sound, and light. And so they have the ability, for example, to do what we call air gap jumping. So most of our really sophisticated networks are not connected to any other network. So you can't hack into them, or can you? Using the technology, such as that which they have been bombarding our embassies with since 1948, by the way, this is nothing new, you can indeed read what's going on a computer without any wireless network or without any wired or optical network. I won't go into the technology of it, but it can be done. I have done it. Also, you can put in malware using the same technology. You can read and you can write. Now, if you ask people in the US national security community if they even know about this, there might be a handful who kind of know about it as something that you can do in theory, but oh, it's too hard. The Russians would never do that. Well, let me tell you, time after time after time, every time we said, oh, the Russians would never do that, no one could ever do that, we could never do that, we found out, yeah, they could do that, and they were doing that. Let me give you another example. Did you know that you can take very high quality pictures, video, with sound around a corner with no mirrors, just shining laser light off a wall? Did you know that if you got in the ellipse south of the West Wing, you could point a certain kind of laser device into the White House, into the Oval Office, and you could hear everything that was said and see everything that was going on? Not to mention reading everything that was on the monitor in a piece of electronics. I have sometimes walked in that very area where you can park right there in the south below the south lawn and kind of watched who's there, who stays there, what do their vans look like? And maybe I've had a piece of equipment or two listening to what was happening. Now, as a foreign intelligence officer, I couldn't actually do anything inside the boundaries of the United States, but I did this kind of a hobby because I'm a ham radio operator. But there's one other thing that the Russians are really good at. I mentioned this business of using what we call side channels, radio frequencies, microwaves, optical techniques such as lasers. But math is probably their biggest weapon, and the reasons are fascinating. In Soviet times, all science was political, biology, engineering, except one, math. It's so pure, and who cared about it? Who could understand it? So the very best minds in Russia became mathematicians. And Rick Proto, again, my Yoda, said to me, he said, you know, Eric, the Russians were as good at making and breaking codes as we ever were. And they had computers about 1 billionth as fast as ours. 1 billionth as fast as ours. And basically, we do what we do using computers. So how could the Russians, with 9 orders of magnitude less compute power than us, keep even with us? The answer, they had smarter math. They worked smarter rather than harder. And he said to me, basically, Eric, everything we have is protected with encryption. The nuclear launch codes, you name it. And we assume that because we can't break a code, that no one can break it. But he said, I stay awake at night when I think about the fact that the Russians now, they just go out on the cloud, have computers almost as fast as what we have. And they had math that was 1 billion times better. You put those two things together, and I don't even want to think about what they could be inside of. And basically, he said to me, Eric, and this is where I'm leading to my wrap up. He said, you have to assume, and I'm not saying this just kind of because I'm a pessimist and just am worried. I'm saying it because I know. You have to assume that the Russians are inside of everything you care about. Everything. If you assume otherwise, you are doing this nation a great disservice. And I won't go into the details, but I will tell you that having assumed that, I started looking for things and finding things that were shocking. But what do you do in a case like Russia, where they're basically not only better than you, but so much better than you, you can't even imagine how much better than you they are? Well, there are ways of dealing with it. And, you know, I was, when I left the, what we call Blue Badger status in 2007, I became a Russian cyber analyst at CIA, which was kind of odd because they hated me for reasons we won't go into. But they hired me anyhow, and I was a Russian cyber analyst because they spoke some Russian and a lot of cyber. And what I discovered is that the Russians have, you know, Rick Proto, again, my mentor said, if you want to know someone's offense, study their defense carefully because it's an inverse. So I carefully studied the Russian defenses, and that's how I learned the stuff that I know. But, you know, the Russians, basically, their belief is that they have to assume that people are inside of them. They're very paranoid. And the kind of things they do, let me just tell you the kind of things that they do. Number one, in their most sensitive areas, they salt it with lots of baloney and bogus information, what they call disinformatia or maskirovka. They assume someone's inside, and they salt their most sensitive stuff with fake information. This is the country that made maps that were purposely wrong, so if anybody invaded them during World War II, they wouldn't know where to go. So this is old school Russian. Number two, they put things on their networks that if you take them back, will have what they call canary tokens, tracer die. So you poke into the abyss and it looks back at you. But more than that, and this was not Russia, this is something, one of our rare cases where we got one leg up from them. In the 80s, when we were not happy with the Russians because of Poland and them cracking down on solidarity, President Reagan wanted to do something to send them a message. We had found out that they were stealing our technology like crazy. And so one of the branches of the government planted some software where the Russians would steal it for their oil and gas pipeline that was going to Western Europe. At a certain point one night, that software caused valves to malfunction, and there was an enormous explosion, costing the Russians billions of dollars, setting them back years and years on their oil pipeline problem. We didn't do it. We didn't actually implant the software to cause the problem. We just left it where they would steal it. And you know, ever since that happened, the Russians have been a little bit more careful what they steal and what they use. And so that's the way to do it. You have to assume, and there are other things that you can do with multiple layers of encryption and abstraction layers and, you know, things that are very technical that I won't go into. But I don't think we are ever, for political reasons, for cultural reasons, for motivational reasons, because we don't have the enemy at our door, the wolf at our door, the way Russia does. We are not motivated the way they are for survival. I don't think we're ever going to be as good as them. Believe me, I have tried. I have gone around Washington trying to get people interested in this problem. I wrote this book in order to raise awareness of this problem. Nothing has happened. So my belief is, okay, That being the case, what do we do about it? And I'm going to conclude by saying, I think the number one most important thing that we have to do, we have to look in the mirror honestly and say, you know what? We're arrogant, we're slow, we're bureaucratic, we have cultural problems, and we're not as good as they are. Because you can't get rid of a problem you don't admit having. And that's the first step. So with that, I will wrap up and open it up to questions. Rick, would you like me to go over the questions that were submitted, or would you like to field some other questions?
Maybe I can start with one, and then we've received a couple via the live chat. So audience members, please feel free to submit others. But maybe I'll just start with one larger one, and that is in your book, which I have read, and it's a great read. So I would definitely recommend folks getting a copy of it. You do come to the one observation, and that is perhaps not your observation, but an observation of the diplomatic corps that, well, whatever gets leaked out there, we just are assuming that Russia's listening to us, that they're going to, hear secrets and names and intents and arguments, etc. And all of that is subordinate to the greater goal of diplomacy, which is the real objective of our mission in Moscow and around the world in relationships with other countries. Can you just address that topic, that maybe all this granular stuff you're speaking about isn't important in the context of diplomacy, or is it in fact what's going to crack the foundations of diplomacy?
Well, it's so complicated. You could argue that one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell apart is they were so good at this stuff and spying that they got lazy. They never had to do any R&D. They just stole our stuff and then, copied it and put it up in their stuff. And so they lost kind of the ability to innovate. And what happened was they always had a lag because they had to steal from us a lot of these things, except in the areas that I'm talking about. And the problem is, and it got into the 80s, a 3-year lag in absolute capability turned out to be more and more because, as we all know, technology is accelerating. So a 3-year lead today is vastly more significant than a 3-year lead 20 years ago. So on the one hand, there was a lot of goodness that happened that the Russians were so incredibly good at stealing stuff. It's a weird argument, but having studied the Russians very carefully, I think that's probably partly true. But there are certain things that you absolutely have to protect at all costs. Our nuclear launch codes are right up there. And the lives of people who are risking their lives every day, Americans and the allies that we recruit to help us. At the end of the day, we have to protect lives. And that was one of the big problems with the State Department. They simply didn't care. They honestly did not care that people were dying because of what they were doing. And that's harsh, but it's true. They had a different mission. There's a saying in Washington, where you stand is where you sit. And the State Department's job is to make friends with people. And our job in national security is to protect against those same people. So I think that you have to be judicious in the information that you designate as family jewels. But because intellectual property and information, more than ever, because remember, the Russians are right. Bits are the new bullets. So if your enemy is stealing all of your ammunition, you're in trouble. So I think there are some things that absolutely have to be protected. And I do not agree with the State Department's assessment.
Thank you. I'll read from one or two of the questions here. And one, again, to the point of your book and also what we're seeing in the national landscape today. Is there any way to stop the bureaucratic infighting in Washington and in the security services, or is that an unavoidable fact of life?
There's no way ultimately to completely stop it. And in a way, it's not all bad. The CIA, for example, was set up as a counterpoint to the Defense Department, who was continually telling the president and Congress, oh my God, the Russians are killing us. They're way ahead of us and everything. Give us more money. And Truman said, wait a minute. And I'm sure I agree with this. So he set up CIA. So creative tension, differences of opinion are actually quite healthy up to a point. It's like all things in life. Too little is bad, too much is bad. The right place is somewhere in the middle. So competition by itself, it can be a good thing. But I think the way to address this issue is actually pretty simple. I spent a lot of time in Iraq, Afghanistan, Islamabad, in the so-called global war on terror. And I observed that cooperation increases as the square of different distance from Washington, D.C. I worked very closely with the CIA station chiefs. I basically, even though I was the equivalent of a 3-star general, I subordinated myself to them and did what they said, to help the cause. And here's what I think we need to do. I think we need to take about half of the whole intelligence community and move it overseas. When I was studying the Pakistani situation, when we were hunting for bin Laden, spent a lot of time over there in that effort. I knew more, having been to Pakistan a bunch of times, than the top Pakistani analysts at NSA who had never been to Pakistan. But more than that, when you're close to your adversary, and by the way, you have to check under your car every day, you have to have a private security detail, you have to carry a weapon, and some of your people periodically get killed or kidnapped right then and there next to you. It tends to motivate you to cooperate with each other. So I believe complex problems require simple solutions. Very complex problems require very simple solutions. The answer is to just tear people out of their offices and send them downrange to where the action is. They'll cooperate a lot more.
Makes sense. I'll combine a couple questions into a similar topic. The last question being, given your view on Russian technological superiority, do you think Russian meddling in the 2020 presidential election is possible? If not, how do you think it will manifest itself? And then as well, what is the Russian objective in infiltrating Facebook and other US social media sites? Maybe comment on their strategy there.
Well, yeah, I saw a question on, did they interfere in the 2016 election? There is very rarely do you ever have anything like consensus among the 17 agencies in the intelligence community. And on that, there was consensus. They did. The extent of it, how they did it, what their intent was, that's murkier. But that they did it is indisputable. They're still doing it. I wrote an article called How to Hack an Election. And I said, if I were the Russians, this is what I would do. And having been given problems, not exactly this, but very like this, when I was kind of, I guess you could call a bad guy for the good guys. I mean, at NSA, I suppose you could say I did horrible things for our nation. So I know what can be done. I know how to do these things. And I'm telling you, if you had given me this problem, it would have been a cakewalk. And the Russians are far better than my team ever was. So could they actually change the outcome of an election? Yes. Simply put, hell yes, they could do it. It would cost them a lot. They would use techniques that don't scale very well. They would have to surgically target about 35 to 60 precincts in swing states, mostly in the suburbs of so-called battleground states. But if they tipped those precincts and only those precincts, just by a few votes, they could do it. And the thing is, no one believes that. All of our election experts say, oh, no, it couldn't be done. I can't tell you how many times I have heard the phrase, oh, it's impossible. Oh, they could never do it. Oh, no one could do it. Oh, we couldn't do it. And over again, and I'm talking dozens of examples, we have been proven wrong. So I'm here to tell you, I know for a fact I have a team that could do it, or had a team. And therefore, I feel 100% sure the Russians, if they wanted to, could do it.
Is it feasible, switching to maybe a slightly different topic, that the president didn't know about the Russian Taliban bounty program, and how might that have filtered its way up to the president or not? And then I would just add a question on that. Is it surprised me that certainly that might be the case, but isn't that an old tactic of war anyway? I can imagine bounties being paid years ago.
Look, let's go again. And I haven't heard this in the news, but those of us who are inside just totally get this. Look, the Russians are in Syria. And they have a lot of troops in Syria, and they're supporting the regime there. We're in Afghanistan. We have troops there. We're supporting the troops in Afghanistan. we are causing lots of trouble for the Russians in Syria. Hello? And so what do? They say, well, you know, there's a price to be paid when you do stuff like that. You're not so invulnerable yourself. You're doing the same thing, you know, a little bit east of here. See how you like it. So of course they're doing it. Now, are they specifically paying bounties? And would that actually matter given that the Taliban love to kill our troops anyhow? I don't know. The total number of casualties is not persuasive. Did the president, was that information sent up to the White House? Absolutely it was. It had to be. And when I was there, you would have been fired if you had not put something like that in the PDB. But did the president read it? Or did his own people call his attention to it? I don't know. I suspect not. I suspect that he's telling the truth when he said he didn't know about it. That doesn't mean it wasn't in his briefing material, because it almost certainly was. But if I had to bet, I would say he didn't know about it.
One question relates to Crimea and the annexation by Russia, and sort of how does that action fit into your view of the Russian strategy overall?
Well, it's part of their strategy. That, again, remember, everything they do is defensive. They're on the defense. They have no money. They're a third world power. Their economy is in the tubes. Until recently, their population had been in decline, and they're losing. You know, just look at a map and you can see that. So they have a strategy of saying, well, no, we got to reverse this. And, you know, the best defense is a good offense. And so they're sending a message also, because we were seriously talking about recruiting Ukraine into NATO, which I think was catastrophically stupid. You know, you want to tickle the dragon's tail, you just recruit former states of Russia into your sphere. You know, I have very mixed feelings about Trump being so-called sweet on Putin. You know, on one level, if it's true, and I don't know whether it's true, if it's true, I don't like it because I don't like undue foreign influence. But on the other hand, Trump has weakened NATO in a number of ways. And that isn't all bad, because to some extent, it could decrease the anxiety of the Russians. And that's a good thing. And so on balance, although I do not like foreign interference in our domestic affairs, I think that we have to look very carefully. And some of you are interested, I would commend to you a book called The Russia Trap by George Beebe, who was head of Russia analysis at CIA, good friend of mine, former coworker. And he talks about the things I'm talking about, how we are looking at Russia through the wrong lens. We're looking at it through the lens of Hitler and expansionism instead of more the lens of World War I and the kind of intricate geopolitical stage that can lead to catastrophe. I do not think Putin is Hitler or Stalin. I do not think he has territorial ambitions. I do think he's very smart, and he realizes that you have to keep your enemy off balance. And going into the Crimea was doing that. And it also set a very strong signal. You're done. No more NATO around us, is what he was saying. And I think we should pay attention to that.
Last question, it appears. Are there any specific areas where the U.S. and Russia could find ways to move past current animosity? I guess where is the common goals?
Well, yes, there are a number of ones. Space is one. I was on the manned spaceflight advisory committee for NASA. And I think that there are huge opportunities in space for cooperation, because we both have the same goals. Yeah, we both have military goals in space, but we both have the human desire to explore. So I would put space as one. I think that political Islam and Islamic extremism are another, because we both face a common threat there, and for the same reasons. And I also think that economically, there is so much to be gained from cooperation with Russia in certain areas. They are world-class at certain things that could be great for us economically and great for them economically. So those would be areas I would focus on.
Okay.
And I guess one last question might be, given your observation of Russia here and sort of the asymmetric way they have to play offense, right, given their size, we now have another country coming up on their heels, China, which has much larger, much greater resources, maybe behind technologically at the moment, but with a potentially much greater ability to project this type of soft or technological power. Any comments regarding China?
Yeah, China's a completely different cat. For one thing, they don't want to do harm to us because we're their biggest customer. Where does all their money and power come from? Us. So think of them as it's kind of like a parasite host, and I won't say who is who, but we're in a symbiotic relationship. We have such economic intertwinement that it is in neither of our interests for there to be hostilities or conflict. So we don't have that with Russia. And that's why I was saying, I think we should reach out to Russia a lot more economically and try to form relationships with intellectual property and so forth, the way we have with China in manufacturing. We need to be economically intertwined with Russia in a way that we are not. So trading partners who rely so much on each other are less likely to go to war. But China, when it comes to spy tradecraft, is a sledgehammer where Russia is a scalpel. You know, the Chinese will throw 100,000 cyber attackers at us, or the Russians will, do one carefully aimed genius malware attack. And so it's a completely different type of approach, requiring a completely different method. I think with the Chinese, some of the techniques I talked about, like fruit of the poison vine, poisoning the well, tracer dye, canary tokens, disinformatia, those kinds of things. I think that if the Chinese started stealing industrial secrets from us and they tried to put them together and they blew up on them, that might slow them down a little bit. And that raises an interesting question in that the Chinese do not differentiate between business and private world and military. It's all the same to them because the PLA runs everything in China. It is literally all military. Mm-hmm. Here is different. You couldn't get national security people to talk to Google and Amazon and Facebook and Apple and Microsoft to do the kinds of things I'm talking about. And so we have a big disadvantage there. And I think that's something when it comes to China that we really ought to think about. I mean, I do go around lecturing to CIOs, trying to say to them, hey, look, you are a target by nation state intelligence services, even though you're not military or political. You are, because that's the battlefield right now, is economics and intellectual property. And all the world's best intelligence services, with the exception of America, their main goal is stealing industrial secrets, including the French, the Israelis, the Brits, the Germans, everybody but us. And so that means that people like me who know what nation states can do really can't help who are the real targets of cyber. I have tried. I went to the CTO of a Fortune 50 company. I did this radar thing where I read data off of a bus, ones and zeros coming off of their most secret computer where they store their quarterly earnings and all that. And the woman says to me, well, it's just ones and zeros. What could anybody do with that? So anyhow, don't get me started on China. That's a completely different can of worms. If you want, I come back sometime and talk about them.
Well, perhaps that's a good segue. We'd look forward to that. And Dr. Haseltine, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the council for your webinar today and your thoughts. So thank you very much. Nora, can I turn it over to you for a closing? Maybe Nora is not on, or maybe on mute.
Well, while we're waiting, I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity, and especially thank you, Peggy. Been a long time since I've seen you, but thank you for steering this my way.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes.
My question for you is, when we travel through the country, we find out that the only newspaper you can get is USA Today. And also people choose certain stations to watch on TV. Why aren't people like you and other people in Washington or who know what's going on globally speaking out to everybody in the country so that they are educated as to what's happening?
Well, do people really care? You know, I mean, that's the thing. It's what made me so angry. And I have some PTSD, honestly, about my time over in Iraq and Afghanistan. And part of it is what happened to me, but part of it is what happened when I got back here. I saw kids dying. I was on medevac planes standing next to just horrible, horrible things. And you get back here and people don't care. I mean, they literally
It's not that they don't care. They don't know about it. They don't know about it because the
yeah, they don't know about it, but they don't necessarily want to know. I mean, I don't actually have the answer, but I have a pretty cynical view of what people really care about. You know, in The World is Flat, Tom Friedman made an interesting observation. He said, over in China, Bill Gates is the Britney Spears of China. He's like a god over there to them as a technologist. He said, the problem with America is Britney Spears is the Britney Spears of America. Mm-hmm. And that's really what you're up against. It's a cultural thing. We're too successful. We're too into our own thing. Generally, most Americans know almost nothing about what's going on in the world. And that's why I'm so happy to meet with people who are interested in what is going on, the World Affairs Council. We need more people like you. But in my day-to-day experiences, I find that people have no knowledge, no interest, and no desire to learn what's going on in the rest of the world. You just look at the world news tonight, for example, on any of the news networks, you see almost nothing about what's going on in Europe, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. Whereas you go to any of those news stations in those parts of the world, you see they cover lots of parts of the world. We are not only ignorant as a society, we are willfully ignorant. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, one thing I do is I'm working on making this book into a movie. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. Walt Disney said something, I know Peggy would have remembered this. He said, you know, you can talk to people's minds or you can talk to their hearts. There are a lot more hearts out there. And so my approach to answering the question you have is I want to tell a story about a person who's an underdog. You know, he had severe problems growing up, severe learning disabilities, all kinds of handicaps. And he wouldn't quit. He just kept going and going and going in an uphill struggle until finally, when everyone was against him, including his old government, he triumphed. And my belief is that people can relate to a personal struggle like that, of overcoming, of being more than what we can be, at an emotional level. And so the only answer I can think to you is don't get people's attention where it ain't. Put your message where their attention is, on stories about people, entertainment, you know, cool stories like Bridge of Spies. I think that's the way to do it.
My husband and I read all the espionage books and we care about America. He was in the service for a long time. The problem is that the question is, does the media drive society or does it reflect society?
It
and
reflects
the problem
society.
is we have allowed China and the media to drive it instead of reflect it because people like you are not speaking out over the media as you should.
Well, that, you know, maybe so, but I think that the news media will just put on what people want. I used to be in a media company. I worked closely with ABC, who we owned. I understand the media very well. I'm a writer. I write for Psychology Today and other media periodicals. And basically, you know, you can only put messages out that people want to hear. So my belief is the media is more a reflection than a driver, although admittedly, it can go both ways.
Thank you, Eric. We'll turn it over to Nora. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Nora?
Yes, sorry, I was having some audio problems here.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you so much for presenting today. I'm immensely grateful for your time and the knowledge that you share with us. I'm especially pleased that our organization is a nonpartisan organization because I personally see one of the challenges that we have is sometimes our political parties put the interests of the party ahead of the American and the nation interests. And I am a government worker myself. And I do see that sometimes by bringing politics into doing our job to serve the nation, we have a tendency of taking sides. And perhaps that delay our progress comparing to other countries that focus on the national interest. So hopefully that's a lesson we can all learn in the long term, but World Affairs Council attempts to bring that bridge of communication. And we truly appreciate what you've done for us today. I personally learned a lot and grateful for that. We had 100, I believe in 92, if I'm correct, individuals who participated in our event today. I hope it was educational and informative for them. We have an event coming up next Monday with Ambassador Rich Haas, and I hope you can visit our website and sign up for the events that is coming up. Also, all the individuals who were participating in our events today will get 50% discount on the membership. In case if you're a guest and you wish to become a member, you can contact our office and they will extend as a courtesy to you 50% on the membership, which regular is 95, so it would be 50% of that. And all of our guests become honorable member of our organization. So you are, Rick, now a member of our organization for 1 year or beyond if you honor us to participate, and hope we'll have a chance to see you again in the future events. Rick, thank you very much
For moderating the event, and wish all of our guests and also a member of our Board of Trustees a wonderful afternoon. And again, Rick, on behalf of the Board of Trustees of World Affairs Council, we thank you for your time and the knowledge that you share with us. Please visit our website for the upcoming event on July 13 and also July 23rd. Thank you, everyone, and have a safe afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Stay
you.
healthy, everyone.
Yep, you too. Thank you, Eric.